Hello, welcome everyone. This is panel 31 in the Conference of the Society for French Historical Studies. The panel we're discussing today is Dressing Up, Costume and Image in 19th and 20th Century France. I'm Carol Harrison. I'm professor of history at the University of South Carolina, and my paper was on costuming the Crimea, on Zouave and Highlander uniforms in the Crimean War, which is part of a larger project on the international diffusion of the Zouave uniform, both on battlefields and on stage. And let my fellow panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Holly Grout. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Alabama. My paper today is about the Dolls of the Grand Review, where I look at Miss Stanguette and Josephine Baker and the commodification of celebrity. This is part of a larger project that I'm working on, thinking about the origins of celebrity in France and relocating those origins away from Hollywood in the United States, as well as thinking about issues of femininity and modernity.
Hi, I'm Dancel Senatiempo with the University of Washington. My paper is on Sarah Bernhardt's use of the Madonna in her autobiography, Ma Double Vie. I specifically look at sartorial code switching, which is a term that I invented to talk about certain aspects of fashion studies, and my larger project involves Georges Sand, Sarah Bernhardt, Colette, and Josephine Baker, and investigates their connections to each other and their usage of sartorial code switching through visual appearance.
Hi, I'm Helen Gramatnev. My paper today is on the hatted nude in the art of the Belle Epoque Paris, which is part of a wider project to do with hats in the art of early 20th century Paris.
Right. Well, I will kick this off because it strikes me that the three of you actually have a lot to say to each other since you're working on a very similar period. And so what I wanted to do is start out by setting up a bit of conversation among the three of you about the subject of eroticism and what your work tells us about what was erotic in the fin de siècle. And I'll start out with Helen's paper because this is a small piece of your paper, but I thought it was super interesting, which is that the hatted nude that seems to have been so important in painting was not nearly as important in erotic photography of the period. And it seems to me that what that suggests is that in many ways identity, being able to identify or at least potentially identify the subject, is part of what makes a photograph erotic as opposed to a painting. And so I thought we could just start out by thinking about this question of where erotic charge comes from in the three papers that y'all have presented. I'll start with that. And Helen, why don't you start since we started with your paper?
Well, the artworks that I've been looking at for this particular paper are focused more on how the hat enhances the sexual appeal and the sensuality of a woman without necessarily identifying her. And perhaps, yes, I haven't actually thought about that, but perhaps in photography that identification would be more necessary in a way, but it's not that all sitters are unidentified, because there are some speculations as to who the sitters were, which models artists tended to use, but the hat takes over. It almost becomes a part of a woman's anatomy. In the art of in the art rather than the photography. Yeah.
I found that a really fascinating part of your analysis, thinking about the hat as an extension of the female anatomy. And I think that what's really exciting about that is that it brings in both this issue of anonymity that you're talking about, but also innuendo. That the erotic is in the insinuation more than in the physicality of the body part itself. And I see that in my characters with Gets legs and just
Yes.
banana skirt, right? It's all about innuendo, but it's also about piecing apart the female body, right? Breaking it into these sort of camera angle bits and pieces and fragments. That it doesn't really matter who the real woman is there, if there is a real woman there. It's sort of this universal hypersexualization. At the same time, that what is really tantalizing is the fact that, as in photography, there is a real woman there somewhere.
Mm,
And I think that's a really interesting connection that I saw as well with Sarah Bernhardt.
mm.
And I was going to ask you also, Helen, kind of going along with that, how you see maybe the label of fetish playing into what you were talking about, because that's what I kept thinking as I was watching your excellent presentation. I kept thinking the hat is kind of a fetish object, right? That is sort of, you know, symbolizing the sexuality, the mystery, the anonymity. It's this signal in the painting, and it's obviously a fetish. I wonder if you could speak more about whether you've seen other clothing items used in that fetishistic way, or if the hat is kind of unique.
I think the hat is quite special in that respect for this for that period, because and that's one of the reasons I chose to focus on the hat. I know Kees van Dongen has used quite a bit of he tends to paint shoes as well, which I found quite fascinating. Did actually want to look at that aspect of it, but the hat is a more universal, if you can say universal, in the Parisian art of the time, and it's to do with the social expectation of women and the image of the Parisienne that was coming up throughout the second half of the 19th century, and it sort of hits it hits its really high point about 1900, and then the hats keep growing throughout the first decade of the 20th century, to the point where I've seen some images of caricatures where the hats are so enormous that it just becomes socially impossible to to interact with the woman underneath. So it's sort of the hat takes over, which is really these really wonderful comic images that make a really valid point. And actually, I think there are American photographs of hatted women or of advertisements for cinema, where they ask you to please remove your hat when you walk in, because they have people trying to climb over the hat, and they're actually made as photographs. A really interesting imagery like that. So absolutely, it is. It's very much a fetish, and I think unlike anything else at the time. Yeah.
And I was also wondering, as you were talking, it reminds me of the hats of the Ancien Régime, right? The wigs and the hats and the big structures that they would build that were so heavy and impressive. It seems like kind of a link there. Like, I don't know if there's a reference, if it's referencing those in some way, but it seems like the extravagant headpieces, that would be a really interesting angle to explore. You did a really good job sort of unpacking the base layer, and I would love to see. Do you have any thoughts about
a bit more of a historical background?
Yeah.
They were very. It actually changes in size quite a bit within a fairly small time period, because they tend to be they tend to be quite small towards the end of the 19th century, and then they start getting really, really big, and then in the 20s they go really small, and it's all about practicality then. Because I think the World War I changes everything in the perception of luxury, and how women, how comfortable women are, as opposed to how well they're presented as a feature or a fetish. But yeah, I have thought about it, but it wasn't. It wasn't. It was sort of taking me on. It would take me on a different path, I think,
Yeah.
with comparison, historical comparison that that much further back. But perhaps that's perhaps that's valid.
Write a book. Write a book.
Yeah, that's right. So I actually wanted to ask you a question, Dancel, about fetishism, because your image of, or the image of Sarah Bernhardt that you discuss in your paper is actually quite conflicting. So she's a celebrity and a desirable woman, but at the same time there's a lot of physical characteristics in her that's not desirable and for the time, and they and the caricatures that you've used in your presentation were really interesting that bring out the well, I guess the anti-Semitic images of Sarah Bernhardt, and I just found how I was interested in how you handle the positive versus the negative when she's negotiating a public image, essentially.
Yes, it's very complicated because she was basically creating a new kind of sex symbol out of herself, and she didn't fit the preconceived narrative of what a sex symbol was. So she really changed the culture, and I think just the sheer force of her charisma and her personality also sort of transferred onto her physical image. But it is a complicated thing. It's something that I'm still unpacking. Is that she appeals to certain people for various reasons, but she also has a huge, core group of detractors who are never going to see her as attractive or even as truly French or even as a woman, really, a lot of them. So in terms of fetishism, I think one of the most important things that she's doing that I unfortunately didn't have time to get into more in the paper is she's playing and sort of dancing around this concept of la belle juive, right? This idea that there are exceptional Jewish women like Rebecca in Ivanhoe, who, they're sex symbols, they're Jewish, but that just sort of increases their danger, their exoticism. And by the end of the 19th century, they sort of merged a little bit with the figure of the femme fatale, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's a concept that she sort of dances around and uses and pulls back from and sort of walks up to that line. And her mother, Yule, was actually really stereotypically the belle juive, right? Who had, a lot of people would say pejoratively that she had seduced Bernhardt's French Catholic father, because belle juives are they're man-eaters, right? So Bernhardt, I think, is cultivating some of that, monstrous power that she likes, that powerful side. But then she's also taking the other half of it where I'm sweet, I'm innocent, I'm attractive, I'm sexually available. And she's creating like this really multifaceted public image, which in certain media forms comes out one way versus the other. Like in her newspaper publicity, it's more shocking, it's more powerful. And then in her autobiography, it's a little bit more concealed by a veneer of respectability.
So maybe it's that duality that's actually enticing to her audiences.
Yeah, they want it both ways. They want the chaste courtesan, the sexy Madonna. I think there is something to be said about the fact that the Madonna figure that she's using is also sexualized. It works both ways.
Yeah, I thought it was striking that the particular Madonna you refer to is the Madonna trampling the snake.
Yeah.
It is the Madonna trampling original sin, trampling evil.
Yeah.
And that strikes me as significant.
I thought it was a little on the nose.
I think
sorry, go ahead, Holly.
I was just going to say, I think that point about being both and neither at the same time is really important. And I found that actually in Carol's paper as well with the Zouaves and the Highlanders. They're French, but not quite, but they're I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you see that playing out and how that fits into this sort of broader narrative about performance and Frenchness.
Well, I think what's particularly striking about this uniform is that if we think about the age of the nation state in the 19th century, there's nothing more associated with the nation state than a national army. And yet what's striking about the 19th century is that, and in the 20th century for that matter, is that in fact in every army, everybody dresses alike. Military uniforms are in fact largely fungible. So that French Zouave uniforms, the fact that they started in North Africa, moved to France, doesn't make them unsuitable, and they have legs, right? They're perfectly suitable for soldiers in Rome, in Hawaii, in the United States. So I think that it suggests something about nations and nation states that's interesting. They focus on difference, but in fact they're very similar, right? They all follow. There's a template for what makes something a nation state, and so yeah, I find these Zouave uniforms particularly interesting in that respect. So they actually made me think, Holly, of dolls. They make me think of like collectible dolls of like nations of the world. I had some of those as a child, where what is striking on the surface is they're all costumed differently, right? So they represent difference. But of course, the point is they are all identical, right? They're the same plastic mold. So that in fact, there's very little difference among the nations of the world, the dolls of the world. And that actually kind of led me to want to ask you about the production of Lenchi dolls. Like, how are they made? Are they identical? Are they made in a mold? Or the pattern? Are they always the same? Would it be worth thinking a little bit about the technology of mass producing dolls?
That's a great question. Originally, they were hand sewn. So they were based sort of on a pattern in the ways that fashion plates would have been used earlier. But they are eventually more mechanized, but they're still sort of exclusive items. So if you see collectors' journals today, these are dolls of high quality that are very sought after among doll collectors, in part because they weren't Barbie. So there weren't quite that many of them. But I think that's an excellent point. I should look into that more and think about that process. I think that makes a good connection to this mass production and movement to mass consumption. And thank you. That's a really great point.
I'm seeing a connection between the idea of the commodity fetish in Holly's presentation and the idea of the commodity fetish of the hat in Helen's presentation.
Well, and I would just add another example, which is that Sarah Bernhardt's relationship with the Madonna passes through the kinds of religious kitsch that were increasingly available in the second half of the 19th century, right? She has a little statuette of a very recognizable virgin, the Virgin with the Snake. It seems to me that it's also a relationship of Bernhardt with consumer goods.
That is an excellent point. Holly, I had a couple of questions for you, kind of building off of what we were just talking about with the dolls and the fashion plates. Do you think that there's any significant relationship between the idea of the Lenchi doll as a dissimulation of personal charisma and personal style? Because you were talking about like the commodification of imagery, of a person's imagery, and how like you can become like Josephine Baker if you wear Baker Fix. You can become like Miss Danguet. You can own a piece of them. Is there any significant connection, do you think, between that and the older fashion dolls that used to be sent around during the Ancien Regime to show off seasonal styles? Because it seems like there is kind of something connecting the two.
I think it's exactly the consumer culture, right? And it's this idea of ownership or access to something that is perceived as unattainable or luxurious. So in the case of the fashion plate, it would have been the fashion itself that was desirable. A lot of those fashion plates were turned into dolls for children to play with, right? So they were sort of paper dolls. So they disseminated those sort of cultural ideas that way. I think with the Lenchi dolls, it's about fashion, but I think it's more so about sort of the appropriation of the idea of a person. So if you look at the Miss Stanguette doll that I show, she is very quintessentially Parisienne. She's very thin. She's got the curly hair, the overexpressive vaudevillian face. Meanwhile, Josephine Baker is very racialized, from her hair to her facial expression to the size of her body. She was not plump in the way that she is portrayed in that doll. So I think that there are a lot of assumptions that are getting tagged onto these dolls and communicated alongside with them. At the same time, the fact that they were coveted by admirers, that people collected them, not to play with them, but to display them, shows us how the star system is beginning to already evolve, in which we all sort of want a little piece of that. We want some of the glamour that comes along with being a Miss Stanguette or a Josephine Baker. We want to have some sort of "they're like us," that we like in our modern stars, right? That we love our celebrities because they're unique and unusual and extraordinary, but we love them too because they're fallible and imperfect and human, and get into trouble and drive us crazy like Sarah Bernhardt, right? With all of her paradox. So I think it really shows us that already by the 1920s, we see that communion between fan and star that really becomes a hallmark of modern celebrity.
And that actually reminds me a lot of, I think it was Kathy Pice who did an article about different makeup types in the 1920s and how, I mean, it strikes me that what you're talking about is that, in the old version of a fashion doll, it was the clothes on the doll that mattered. The doll could be given to a child, the clothes were what mattered. But now what you're saying is that the commodity is the person, right? That their whole personality, their physicality, their whole essence is up for grabs. It's commodified. They are the fetish. Their body is the fetish. And this reminds me a lot of what Kathy Pice talks about. I believe it's Kathy Pice who talks about, makeup types where, you can have this makeup color palette. It's called the Sheila. A Sheila is a girl who is like this. Or you can have the Betsy. The Betsy is more proper and her color palette is this. It's like a whole personality that you are buying and trying on. Make yourself someone else.
That's right. And I think this is an extension of that, right? If you have a Josephine Baker doll on display, or you have a Miss Stanguette doll on display, you're sending messages about yourself, right, to the people who see that, that you hope to have some sort of an association, some sort of affinity that one would think would be positive, right, that you would be associating with that. And I think the Kathy Pice analogy is right on. I mean, she talks later in the 40s about the hussy, right, the red lipstick, and other certain identifiers that get marked through these commodity products. And I think the dolls are another example of that. And I think it's also this interesting tension between the embodiment and disembodiment of the female. That the female body in particular, has the capacity to carry these messages in both a way that is very embodied. It's very much the real Josephine Baker or the real Miss Stanguette that carries these particular signals. At the same time, the dolls, they're completely disembodied. And somebody who doesn't know the real woman would look at it and say, well, that's just a doll of somebody, maybe, right? Or just a generic doll. So that's a tension I'd like to explore more, thinking about these issues of embodiment and disembodiment. And I think that's something that all of our papers have hit on in a variety of ways, thinking about the role of the body and the issues of authenticity and reality behind the fantasy. And if that's something I would love for us to talk about some more.
Yeah, I mean, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Holly, I really found interesting your ads of Josephine Baker for hair products, and how it just basically focused on the head. And it made me think, is it because that is something that a traditional French woman would be more easily able to associate with, that she couldn't attain a body of Josephine Baker, so therefore using the head and the hairstyle was a way of identifying with the celebrity.
I think what's happening is, as product endorsers, both Baker and Miss Stanguette are vehicles, right, for particular kinds of products. So on the one hand, it makes perfect sense, right, that you're selling a hair product, you're going to focus on the hair. You're not going to focus on the other parts. At the same time, however, we have to remember that they were also vehicles in their own commodification, right? They were performers. So there were publicity advertisements images in the media that were to sell their show, to sell the performance, that focused on Miss Dingett's legs, or Josephine Baker's frenetic dancing, right? So it's interesting because what happens then is I think we see a multiplicity of discourses, that these women are vehicles in their own commodification. At the same time, they're endorsing these other products. Miss Dingett with her, sewing machines notwithstanding, but the other things that they're selling, and they're very aware of this. And I think that this is something that gives us a vision of the female consumer as well as the female producer as more empowering, that they are not just sort of complacent, that they're not complicit in their own commodification, but they're actually driving that train because they're making a lot of money. They are also expanding their own publicity and notoriety. They're creating their own celebrity brand through these things. And I think that that's a really more empowering narrative of women in the consumer market than we sometimes get in the 20th century.
I have a couple of questions about, well, for Holly and then for Carol as well. I want to talk about racialization a little bit because both of you hit on that really well, I thought, in your presentations, and kind of the flexibility, like Carol in your presentation, the zouave, getting so far removed from its origins and just becoming sort of this floating signifier that anybody can be, right? I thought that was really fascinating. And then Holly, thinking about Josephine Baker's head, like Helen was saying, it's picturing her from the head down, focusing on her hair. I'm still trying to tease out this idea, but I come across stuff where Baker is talking about how she would try to get rid of her black hair, right, by doing these harsh chemical treatments, and then she would burn her scalp. And so the Eton crop probably, it seems like, was at least partially related to white identification because she lost a lot of hair, and so she had to slick back what she had, and she talks about having to paint the back of her head, and that's why it had that lacquered look. And so the Eton crop and her shiny head are actually markers of desperately trying to erase black hair, fit into this, these impossible standards that she had to meet in all these different ways. And then she's being held up to white French women as, you can have hair like this. But I noticed in the ad that you showed, her hair is very glossy and falling kind of softly and curling a little bit. It looks like it's been relaxed. And so I wonder if you could speak briefly about like the complicated racialized and I mean, it's a very weird thing, right? So she's trying to make her hair more white. She burns it off, adjusts it, and then now she's being held up, and it's like this cycle, right?
Would you like to go first?
Sure. I'll address your paper first, but it struck me that, Holly, that your work was very reminiscent of the project on the modern girl that several of our colleagues did at the University of Washington, in which they argued that by the 1920s, the modern girl, being a modern girl, is in many ways about ethnic ambiguity.
Oh, yeah.
And it seems to me that that's what that advertising suggests. And I think there's something really powerful in that. And I think that the pleasure of being a zouave is about exploring that ethnic ambiguity, and that it's enormously liberating for bourgeois Europeans to pretend to be something else. And in many ways, the vaguer that something else is, the better, right? The more pleasure there is, because the freer the performance can be. But I think that that we tend to think, well, we're interested in knowledge of the colonial world and things like that as a way of exerting power over colonized people. But I think it's also a form of self-liberation, of adding possibilities to bourgeois life that don't otherwise exist. And that pleasure, I think, is considerable.
Thank you. That was a beautiful answer to the question. I think that it's the racial ambiguity, it's the ethnic uncertainty, it's the play, right? It's the element of play and possibility. And in some ways, this gets us back to that authenticity question. Does it matter that Baker's hair was burned off because she was trying to make it more white? Or does it matter that people perceived that there was a certain kind of racially ambiguous modernity about her, with this hairstyle that she's trotting out that makes you want to be like her? And then what does that tell us about the way that the French are thinking about race in the 1920s because this is on the body of a Black African American woman? Are they seeing those color lines as distinctly all of the time? And if not, then how do we understand, or how do we get to a more complicated understanding of how they're thinking about race in the 1920s?
And Carol, I loved your answer because it made me think of, the idea of racialization itself as a commodity, right? That you can be this kind of possessive, like, colonial master idea. And in the early 1920s, right, travel is expanding. Suntanning becomes popular because now if you're wealthy, it's a status symbol to be able to travel to all these different places and get a suntan. And so then you become ethnically ambiguous just by having that deep tan that you might have from traveling to all these lands and interacting with all these cultures. And then you appropriate and bring back whatever you want, right? Because this is how it works, right? You're the white colonial subject. That ties in really well. I wanted to ask you about, kind of building off that, the role of Orientalism as a cultural movement as it relates to your topic, because it seemed like that was a really central feature, that Orientalism is this driving force in how popular the Zouaves become. I don't know if you could speak more to that.
Certainly. And of course, I mentioned just briefly the Zouave emerges out of French North Africa, the Zouave regiments created in 1830, immediately after the conquest. And so, yes, certainly initially the Zouaves are, they're tools of conquest. But I think very, very quickly, as I said, they turn into sort of tools for bourgeois Europeans to liberate themselves, to be able to play other ethnicities, to be able to play other sexes. And so I'm very interested in, I think it's John Mackenzie, a British scholar, who's written a good deal about Orientalism, who does set aside in some ways Said's sense that Orientalism is always an instrument of domination, to look at it as a field of play and of possibility, again, for the colonizer, of course, but nonetheless as a sort of a way to invent oneself. And so, yeah, that's been my approach to it. And it also, I'll just add that it has the effect of allowing French colonizers to downplay the violence of the conquest, because, the Zouaves are engaged in razzias and all kinds of unspeakable violence. But because the Zouave is basically just such a cheerful, good kind of guy, none of it seems really as bad in say, the newspaper reports.
And there's a link there between the Zouave and the Scottish person, the Scottish soldier who's also been a victim of colonial violence, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
Isn't it interesting that it all comes back to escapism and the cross-dressing, the fetishism, the costuming, or the dolls? It's all about escaping your reality.
Mm-hmm. And I would just throw in another form of cross-dressing and escapism that we haven't touched on. How old was Sarah Bernhardt when she was playing L'Aiglon?
L'Aiglon, she was in her 50s, I believe. Yeah. Yeah.
Here's a cross-dressing for you in which there's enormous pleasure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right, when a 50-year-old woman can play a teenage boy.
Yeah. And one of her finest moments was when she made her voice higher and clearer to say, "I'm 19, sir," during her performance of Jeanne d'Arc. And she was in her 60s at that point, and everyone just burst into applause because she sounded 19.
Yeah.
Escapism, yeah.
Fascinating point about the Zouave costume and the Highlander. My understanding is that the Highlanders in the 19th century, are you there?
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
I lost a
in
little
the 19th
bit of
century,
it.
the Highlander Brigade was viewed as, at least among the armies of the United Kingdom, as not just fanciful in their dress, but also among the most vicious and warmongering groups, the most celebrated. Do we see that with the Zouave as well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Savage other.
Sorry?
The savage other, right?
Zouave indiscipline is permissible in the army because they are so ferocious. Right?
Mm.
They're such good soldiers, they can be allowed to get away with forms of indiscipline that ordinary soldiers wouldn't be allowed.
It's just so fascinating, right? That level of ferocity and sort of uber manliness that gets attached to that, and yet one of them's wearing skirts and the other one's wearing pantaloons that look like skirts, and the possibility for cross-dressing. And do you have to be uber manly to be able to express your femininity in some sort of way that is acceptable? I think that's an interesting thing to think about.
I think it's total freedom.
It's also, isn't it though, like an interesting way of othering, right? That you see in a lot of scholarship about. I'm thinking of imperial leather, right? The idea that like gender and Orientalism are so entwined that the Orientalized man is actually kind of gender indeterminate, and that's a way of othering him as well. Like he's more animalistic, he's more sexual. There's a lot more gender fluidity happening, and not like us Europeans. And that whole like, you know, sexual energy, animal energy, fluidity, strangeness, monstrosity. Let's harness that and use it for our advantage, but we're also kind of scared of it, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Duality. Yeah, back to duality.
Well, I'll just throw this open. Any last questions that you were anxious to get in?
One of the big things that struck me that I was interested in, everyone may be saying a bit about, is this issue of authenticity. This is something that I've struggled with in all of my work, thinking about if we're talking about people who are willfully performing a self, can we ever get to a level of authenticity, right? Are we always stuck at this level of play acting and posing? And then what are the implications of that for us as historians?
Seems like a really good question to pass around. Anyone want to take the first go with that? I will. I'll say that my interest in this comes out of a sense that we often think of soldiering as being men at their most authentic, right? That there is nothing as authentic an experience as soldiering. And I think that is, in the 19th century, clearly not true. I think it is politically problematic and damaging. And so I'm interested in the Zouaves to push back against the idea that going to war is the most authentic representation of manliness. Helen, Dansley, y'all want to take this question about authenticity?
I think authenticity for me and the hatted women, as well as the hatted nudes, it's the hat allows you to become something else. But then when I started looking at the hatted nudes, it was about exposing the reality in a way, and I touched on that. I touched on that in my paper, that the fact that they're not idealized, and the fact that you can't see their face, it's hidden, and that the fashion imposes a level of non-authenticity, and the woman underneath is actually quite fragile. It's not the beautiful, fantastic Parisienne that is that should be what people aspire to, or what women aspire to, but it's a real human being. And I think that in a way that the hatted nude is, for me, the hatted nude is what reveals that more than anything else, more than any other images of hatted women in the Belle Epoque or in the early 20th century.
I think I'm interested in the line of scholarship that I'm in because I am kind of looking for more information about this question of authenticity. I think you hit that on the nose, Holly. I remember reading Jones and Stallyrass's article, Renaissance, the Materials of Memory, about the Renaissance and how fetishism, with the advent of early capitalism and the slave trade in particular, becomes this denigrated thing, and we're supposed to separate ourselves from the commodity and throw things away and buy new ones and not hang on to things and think that they're magical. But in a lot of our scholarship and all these presentations, I see evidence that that is not true, that modern life and the questions of authenticity have led people to fetishize the commodities that they're not supposed to be that attached to, that you're supposed to throw it away and buy a new one to feed the economy. But people are hanging on to these Lunchy dolls, and people are, having sexual feelings about hats, and people are building whole like fantasies around military uniforms as an identity for your whole self. And it seems like that supposed, transitional period where we made a break with our, whatever you want to call it, more visceral or primitive selves didn't work. That we still are trying to find meaning and authenticity through fetishizing behaviors. And I think that's where material culture is. Material culture is a really useful way of studying that phenomenon, I think. Paradox that we're living.
Well, we could probably keep going on the subject of material culture, but I don't think we have any more time. So I will thank you all and wrap this up. Thanks so much.
Everyone, this was
Thank you.